We are in lesson 4 of our study of the nature of God, and we're talking about this comparative discussion of creation versus evolution, for lack of a better way to describe that. And we've been trying to emphasize and understand the fact that believing in creation is really the best choice you've got. And when you think about what evolution requires us to believe, in some senses outside of reasonableness, I think that you find that the creative narrative within Genesis is the most reasonable. Even in some senses, take, and I don't like to do this, but take away the idea of believing in Jehovah God and the God of the Bible, and just remove all that for argument's sake for a moment, and just appreciate the fact that if you laid both theories, if you wanted to call them both a theory for a moment, and you lay them side by side, which of them seems more reasonable? That our world was designed and fashioned and created in such a way that it serves its purposes exactly the way it needs to, or by happenstance and chance from origins unknown, here we are. And I'm not trying to be ridicule or belittle or chastise. I'm trying to simply point out that believing in the creative power of someone who put this earth into existence, designed, fashioned, perfectly suitable for earthly life, is the most reasonable explanation of how we got here. Now, add my faith and confidence in Scripture and my belief in the testimony of the Bible, and that leads me to conclude that it was Jehovah God of heaven that did all that. And that it was the God of the Bible that helps us appreciate and know how it is we got here and how it is we're able to sustain our lives here upon the earth. And the confusing part has been that men have tried, and they've argued it separately. They've tried to just pit the two theories or two thoughts against each other. But men then over the years have also tried to melt them together, which has only served really in many ways to confuse the issues even greater and really doesn't satisfy, honestly, it doesn't satisfy either side of that discussion. The pure evolutionist is bothered by anyone who would try to imply that God is involved at all, and genuine believers in Scripture are also equally offended by the idea that somehow we've got to blend evolution and creation in order to come up with an understanding of how we got here. That we can't just rely upon the fact that God spoke His Word and put this earth and creation into existence. So we're in lesson 4, and I want to pick up right there in your lesson sheets where it says the Big Bang Theory, that caption that you'll find in your lesson sheets. Because this is the most predominant of the basic theories of how things got started in the evolutionary process. Little tidbit of interest that I throw at you here. In Huntsville, Alabama, there is a NASA center where you can go. If you're not familiar with that, a lot of the things that involve NASA are happening in Huntsville, Alabama. We see all the rocket launches and stuff coming out of Cape Canaveral, right in Florida, but a lot of what happens with the testing and the research and so forth comes out of Huntsville, Alabama, and they've got a really nice museum there that you can go and visit. I've been there a couple of times when I lived in the South, but here's what I'm driving at. So when Deborah and Sam was a baby, so we're talking, roughly 20 years ago, we were in Alabama, and I had visited that science center before and found it very educational and because it dealt with basically space exploration. It dealt with what we had actually done in terms of going into space. I'll get there. Trust me, I'm getting where I'm going. So we're sitting in the big IMAX theater that I had been to before to watch their current presentation. And guess what all of a sudden was at the NASA presentation on their big IMAX? It had switched from just telling us about what they had done with the space shuttles and the various rocket launches and how all of those reality, factual things that they could show, and it became a discussion about the Big Bang Theory. Now, here was what was heartening to me about that. Now, keep in mind, you're in the Bible Belt, right? Down in that part of the country. You're in the Bible Belt. And up stood at least a dozen families, including my own, and walked out of that theater. When it no longer was teaching about what the space exploration and what NASA had accomplished in terms of those things, and it became about espousing evolution and the Big Bang Theory and creation as opposed to creation. 12 or so families that are sitting there in that audience get up and walk out. Now, here's my question. I told you I'm getting there. I wonder how many would get up and walk out now. I wonder what 20 years has done. Now, maybe, I don't know, Mark kind of lives down in that Bible Belt area. It's possible, I suppose, that there might still be folks that get up and walk out of that, but I'm not so sure that there would be that many people willing to kind of say, we're not listening to this. And it wasn't that I'm opposed to opposing thoughts or being educated and learning something. That's not really what it was about. It was about the fact that they're trying to indoctrinate the people that are coming in that theater who came in there to learn something about what they've done with rockets and space shuttles, and all of a sudden it becomes about the Big Bang Theory. And they got Morgan Freeman, and his big booming voice on there, and how could you reject anything with the voice of Morgan Freeman behind it? And here we go, right? But this is the theory that is espoused, believed, proclaimed, and again, I'm not opposed to fair and open debate and discussion, but this wasn't a discussion forum. This was you. Yeah, you sit here. You bought a ticket, and you sit here and listen to what we're going to espouse as fact, without any ability whatsoever to actually be part of the narrative. And that was why you felt compelled in some senses to just get up and walk away. Because when you begin to espouse things as factual and all other considerations are not even mentioned and or maligned, then that's not open and fair discussion or debate about any issue. But that's what happened 20 years ago, and I can only imagine it's worse today, just in my own mindset. But of all the theories science has come up with about man's history to explain how the creation came to be, certainly the one known as the Big Bang Theory is the best man has been able to invent. It does not solve the problem of the creation itself because it assumes that the matter already existed and that the previously existent primeval mass exploded to produce the cosmos as we see it. In other words, something exploded, and that explosion, that Big Bang, then sent and created matter that then begins to form the universe and the things that are within the universe. What's the great question? I keep coming back to this because this is crucial in the discussion and the comparison or contrast between the two. What's the big problem with that? Where did that energy come from? That is the gaping hole in that argument. Where did that energy come from? You can't espouse in some senses that here was this great, enormous explosion that basically had enough energy and power to create matter without any explanation whatsoever as to where that energy came from. And that's the weakness. And then once you weaken the premise or the baseline of the theory, then it creates challenges and missteps from that point forward. And so understand that if you don't, and we're going to talk about a lot of things that the author of the workbook kind of put in here for us to look at, but if you can just wrap your mind around that basic principle, where did the energy come from? And if there's no answer to that, which there isn't, then maybe that whole theory needs to be re-examined as to whether there's any truth or factualization about it. Thoughts or comments? I'll slow down. Go ahead, Chad. That is a great question, Chad. If once, why not? Why aren't there consecutive moments like that?
Look at the last period on that paragraph on your page. This is what they believe. Everything comes from a dot smaller than a period on page.
Yeah.
And then some, but about, I think, what did I read? In 20 billion more years, it's all going to come back into a little song. They come back out.
Yeah.
So they believe it is going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, when you can say it'll happen in 20 billion years, that's a pretty easy argument, right? Not necessarily to believe, in my humble opinion, but it's one easy to throw out there because nobody's going to be what? Nobody's going to be around to validate it or invalidate it, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to throw these wide range. But it's an excellent point, Chad, as to why not? And then those kinds of questions, I think that's why they come up with these kinds of responses. Well, it will happen again 20 billion years from now when it all shrinks to that critical small, combine, and then it'll re-explode and again, I'm very cautious with this issue because I know as the time has come and gone, and I'm not saying this offensively, folks, but there's a lot of gray hair in this room. Okay? And the truth is, we've got a whole new generation, right? Maybe 2-3 generations underneath you that we're trying to reach with the gospel. And what may not have been a big deal to you to have to kind of work through is a big deal for younger people today. It's a big challenge. I told you, anyway, I've shared with you some things in the past about, just anecdotally, about this. And that's not a criticism of this generation because, by the way, I don't blame this generation for that. Because in some ways I wonder whether maybe we didn't do a good enough job of speaking up at the right times in the right ways. Because we let the academic world take over this discussion. And we put up some small fights here and there. But they're being taught the theory as being fact. And you're ingrained in your mind, fact after fact after fact. I'll anecdotally share something with you about what was he? He was probably about 18 years old. A young man came to me one time. And he said, Brian, he says, I want to tell you, he said, I want to admit something to you. And he said, because I had preached some lessons on this, it wasn't here. And he said, oddly, he said, I lived in two worlds. He said, when I was at church, I was a creationist. When I was at school, I was an evolutionist. He said, I never processed in my mind that the two were counter to each other. And this wasn't an unintelligent young man. It was just the way he had been presented the information. In his mind, it was just one was what you were from an academic, in some senses factual, evidentiary, scientific mindset. That's what you were over here. But I believed in God, and I was a religious guy and tried to do right and live right over here. And he never really thought until in his late teens that those two mindsets were actually counter to one another. And that challenged him. Yeah. Yeah. And you've got a number of them that are never, and I'm cautious of that, but are challenged to ever hear the opposing thought of a creator. And the other challenge to that is even those who are religious, and I'll throw them all in kind of a great big pile for a minute. We don't get them 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. We get limited public opportunities. So the burden comes back to who then? The parents. The burden really comes back to the parents to be doing what they can to remind their students or their children and educate their children that this is what you're going to hear when you go to school and in your science classes. And then on occasion, you'll get lucky and you'll run into a science teacher here and there who has a Christian background, and that'll aid you a little bit through that. But that's rare. That's not very often does that occur. And so we've got to do our jobs in making sure that we reinforce all these things. These are fair questions, right? Underneath that paragraph. What caused this matter to explode then? Okay, here's this small tiny dot. What caused it to explode? Was it gases? Okay, if yes, then where'd those gases come from? All of those things that evolutionists has to accept by what? By faith. All right, so don't let anyone ridicule you as a believer and as somebody who has faith as your core, at your core, that leads you to your convictions about creation, because either one of these you want to put your faith in, you're putting your faith in, right? There are going to be elements of the unseen that you're going to have to put your faith and confidence in. I put my faith and confidence in a God who had the knowledge and wisdom to design and fashion an earth and a universe that can function exactly the way it needs to sustain the life that He created. And I look at all the evidence and I see the design of all those things, and I make that conclusion based on faith. Well, they didn't see it explode. They can't replicate it. They can't tell you where the gases come from if that was the source of the explosion. So they have to accept on faith that those things were present in order to allow for that. And so, in some senses, both are religion, and both share a sense of need for faith unseen in order to accomplish that. Yeah, and there is some truth to that, and yeah. You're fine.
I want to make an addendum to what you said about your school. Okay, now what if a child in school does that? So as a teacher, what I'm going to do? You're suspended. If they walk out.
Yeah.
Or if parents decide to pull them out of that school, they'll get rid of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, and that's Brian, and that's the disappointing part about this is we've not just gone to the idea that evolution is the believed and presented as fact state-sponsored message, but we've gone to the idea that if you even espouse anything else, yeah, you can't have any other contrary thought, which is contrary to education. But I guess I'm not running in 3 years. So anyway, that's all out there. But irregardless of those things, you can have challenges. And again, I think you're right, Ron. I think we've disallowed, and here's, we could talk about these things forever, but here's the other part of that. Then to believe evolution, you're the enlightened, intellectual, intelligent one. To believe in a God, you're the superstitious, unintelligent, and that's the argument that has been made that belittles anyone who takes the view of a belief in God. And again, there are exceptions to those rules. There are small snippets here and there of things that you can kind of point to that say, well, that's a positive. But as a whole, and it only gets worse the further up the chain of education you go, as it relates to those things.
And what's sad too is there are those in the church that are trying to come up with theories that will meld the two together, where you can believe in creation and
Yeah.
evolution, and whether it be saying that the 6 days of creation were not literal days,
Yeah.
whatever it is, so that you can kind of,
Yeah.
allow
Yeah.
evolution to take place.
Yeah. I'll come back to you, Bob.
So, what we're trying to say in all this, these great United States says we have freedom of religion. We no longer have that. We're forced by the state to accept and believe something, or be punished for it, as Brian pointed
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
If we don't accept it,
Yeah.
what's wrong with this?
Yeah. And that and that's a challenge. Um, uh, where an erosion of freedom uh, to believe how you want to believe as long as you believe like me. You're free to do that, and that's kind of the mindset. And maybe I'll for sake of devil's advocate in some senses, I think that intolerance levels on both sides of the equation. Um, America's a weird kind of thing in some senses when it comes to that, because I have to be cautious that when I claim, I have the right to believe this. We're free in this country to believe that God created us and to speak that without fear of retribution. And in the other side, I accept the fact they also have the right to say and speak what they believe about the origins of our earth and world, and to allow them the same level of freedom to speak. And that, I believe, is where the challenge is in modern American society. Is it used to be anybody could speak what they believed about something, and there was a level of tolerance to that. But now it's pick a side, and intolerance is perfectly permissible against anybody who's opposed to you. And that's where maybe we've clouded these issues with more problems than maybe we need. Everyone has a right to speak their mind and say what they believe, and let the evidences point to what. But when you tell one side you no longer can speak, then that's not a free and open society, and that's more political than I ever want to be. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, and we're going to get there in this study. They talk about that in this study about those things. So is it reasonable to believe that out of disorder, explosion, came an orderly universe with trillions of galaxies, and each galaxy with about 100 billion stars? Is it reasonable to believe that lifeless matter produced life? Or is it more reasonable to believe that an explosion in a print shop produced a dictionary than to believe that an inanimate matter exploded, making this amazing orderly universe and produced life? I've heard it said this way: evolution, in some senses, is like saying a tornado hits a junkyard and a 747 comes out the other side of it. And again, that's not a ridicule. It's an illustration of the reality that an explosion of some sort or kind was able to create order. Generally, when I've seen things explode, is there order at the other side of that? No. If you've ever watched an explosion of any type or kind, generally speaking, order doesn't come from it. What comes from it? Disorder. So in every other circle and in every other circumstance, explosions create disorder. Except for this universe and world that we live in, in that case, an explosion created order. Again, the question isn't about who's smarter than the other guy. The question is which one is more reasonable in the discussion, and where does honesty lead me to conclude in that relationship? Mm-hmm. and Randy, the truth is what they do is at times they have to ignore the very science that they espouse. There are many times when it comes to defending evolution, they have to deny, and again, there'll be some examples of that before we're done here, but they have to deny the very things they've actually been able to prove scientifically that are counter to what they're saying on the other side of this. Well, and I think, Randy, and again, let's go back to the core reason. The core reason all this got started was because they didn't want to believe in what? In God, okay? We don't want to believe in God. And so, because we don't want to believe in God, we've got to come up with an alternative answer to how we got here. Because for the longest time, basically, that was the answer, right? God created, and that was a generically accepted principle among many societies, in particular our own. But as it progressed, people from Darwin forward, and probably even earlier than him, who did not want to believe in God, were trying to find alternative ways. And so when you're determined that at the end of the day, I'm not believing in God, then I'm willing to turn a blind eye to certain evidences because God is not going to be something I accept. And so I'll reject even evidences of my own scientific community because I'm not going to believe in God. And I think that's where that stems from.
They'll use circular reason and make assumptions.
Yeah.
This has to be true, and this has to be true. Okay, and they'll also do something called shifting the burden of proof. Let me give you an example of that. You have millions of years argument.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. Okay, we have a water. Now, the moment you cut into it, it turns red. And really, the inside of it's blue until you cut it. See? Cut it. See? I'm right.
Yeah.
Red for whatever call it.
Yeah.
And they'll use just silly arguments like that. But it's a circular reasoning. They try to date the fossils using this and then try to do this with the fossils.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to show it to you. I've got a picture of that concept where even in a museum environment where in this display it says, check out this 10 million year old rock, and we know it's that old because we found it in this 10 million year old fossil layer. And then over in this display it says, check out our 10 million year old fossil layer. And we know it's 10 million years old because we found this 10 million year old rock in it. Now wait a minute. You can't use one to prove them, right? But that's circular reasoning. That's part of the equation or part of the process in which they go through to try to make those arguments. They'll presuppose things all the time, and then once the presupposition is said to be true, then I begin to base all kinds of other things on that.
It's never been observed and tested. There's like, 8 layers? None of them have ever been found and observed. It is purely fiction, and it's just a theory. And Darwin used that theory when he was on his ship going around the world, and he found 14 varieties of finches.
Yeah.
Like, oh, they have different big sizes. See, that's evolution.
Yeah.
Preacher, by the way.
Yeah.
Preacher. But,
we're not all good, but go ahead.
But no, it's just... It's based on, so they have to date the fossils by the geological column, which has no proof. So if you see that in a textbook, it is 100% false. It is not true. Absolutely not true.
And again, those are all just part of the whole process of trying to understand these two contrasting views of how we got here, and which one is reasonable. In order to accept. Just understand the basic definitions here. By evolution, they mean the theory that non-living matter became alive. Just let that sink in for a minute. That something that wasn't alive spontaneously came alive. Just think about it. That this original living matter was simple in its organization, and that the world of living things known today, including us, man, gradually developed from these original simple forms. And so non-life created life, created it in simple form, and then over enough time, those simple forms changed and became complex forms, like man. It's generally an accepted belief system that many have, and as the way by which non-living matter evolved into plant life, and plant life evolved into animal life over millions of years. And this is the best, think about this, this is the best theory available for one who does not believe there's an intelligent creator who made the world and everything in it, as Acts 17 verse 24 illustrates. And so just all we're asking for anybody to do, I don't ask anybody to ever, in anything for that matter, to take my word for anything. I'm just simply asking folks to lay them side by side and then ask yourself the question, which is the more reasonable conclusion as to where I came from and how I got here and how this earth and world arrived here. That something that wasn't living became living, and that simple living thing was able to then change over a span of millions and millions of years, something much more complex. And it was once a plant, and now it's an animal, and all of the variants that have to happen throughout all of that process. Or, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And on the sixth day, He created man. Yeah, and you're right, Diane. There'll come a time, according to Scripture, where everyone will grasp this concept better. But the important part right now is to try to encourage folks to begin to believe it now, when it can benefit them. Yeah. Pam, that has been, to me, one of the most challenging aspects to anyone who there ought to be. They can't all evolve simultaneously according to their own theory. So there ought to be variants. You ought to be able to walk around this earth right now and see forms that haven't caught up to the ones that we're able to. There ought to be evidences all around us of those things. And they're not there. Yeah. 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 And the quick answer to any of those kinds of questions is always this: time. That's the quick answer, is that, well, there's been too much of a time span. There would have been, but we're not talking about a couple thousand years. We're talking about millions, and so there would have been variants 2 million years ago. But in 2 million years, they'll see the you know what I mean. It all comes back to that anytime they stumble over a question like that.
You ever heard the fairy tale of the frog that turned into a prince?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same story. Except you got one element.
Yeah. And so there's a general theory and a special theory of evolution. Macroevolution, or the general theory, attempts to explain the origin of all plant life coming from non-living matter, and that plant life evolved into animal life. Microevolution, or the special theory of evolution, states that limited changes take place within kinds of plants and animals. And microevolution is an established fact. And I want you to appreciate this. And microevolution is an established fact and does not conflict with what God said about an animal reproducing according to what? According to its kind. You may have a smaller horse or a bigger horse, but at the end of the day, it's a horse, right? The Bible spoke to this, that animals and plants were able to reproduce after their kind. And at the end of it, the only thing that could produce factual evolution would be is if the horse was now a dog, right? It would have to change its kind in order to prove, because that's what evolution says. Evolution says we had one kind, a single-celled amoeba, and that kind was able to change its kind into something else, and to something else, into something else, into something else. Micro, that's macro. Micro evolution is perfectly acceptable and works within what the Bible has already said. There are variations and changes and differences within the same kind of animal. And God said that was the way things were going to work in the creation that He established.
One of the things that after you say that, though, they'll say, what's a colon? Yeah. What is a colon? What's the difference between kind and species? And this one I wrestled with.
Yeah.
And then I found in the scripture what the definition is of colon as seed in itself. Yeah. So that's what Alpha King James Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
As seed is as seed.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things they'll ask you.
Yeah.
Is what do you mean by colon?
Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions up to that point? We've got a few minutes left. Let me move briefly into this discussion. So, there's always this discussion about the missing link, right? They'll show you these pictures, and here's the monkey, and then they'll show you that progression all the way through. But they'll talk about, attempts to find, as if it was a what? A singular missing, if we could just find this one, we've got all the others, right? We've got everything in between. We just need to find the one. The truth is, in the progression from monkey to man, there are many, many, many missing links in that chain that really show the fallacy of the whole. And in many senses, it gets to, in my mind, gets back to what Pam mentioned earlier. Where are they? There ought to be evidence. They can't all evolve simultaneously. And so where are they? There ought to be evidences all over the place of the intermediate stages between monkey to man. But they don't exist. This scientist in the book Science is a Sacred Cow says of the phrase missing link, it is a most misleading phrase because it suggests that only one link is missing. It would be more accurate to say the greater part of the entire chain is missing, so much that it is not entirely certain whether there is a chain at all. And amen to that, right? Unless he had just come out and said there isn't, would have been a greater statement. But there's too many empty holes in the process to even believe it's a chain at all and a connection at all. Again, there ought to be all kinds of evidences around us if there was any truth to it. Fossils revealing undisputed transitional forms of one kind of animal evolving into another kind of animal have not been found. In other words, where is an example? There ought to be within the fossil record somewhere. There ought to be an example of an animal that was in transitional stage from being a bird to being a cat, or from being there ought to be somewhere in the fossil record where you can see a transitioning animal, where you see it changing from one kind to another kind. And again, it's not there. They're just not there. All right, Lord willing, we'll come back. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday.